sessions, either ones that have already happened or training sessions that we have upcoming. Specifically, we have a session next week on views, user types, and templates, and we have a session the week following which concerns print profiles and printing. So those are the items that we won't be covering today. What we will be covering today are all of the bulk record operations. That means your find and replace tools, adding and removing various codes and terms from your records, certain statistical operations you can do with your bulk tools, changing record owners, changing public and non-public. We'll also be covering the general setup options for both modules, your agency setup, the core community setup. We won't be covering the volunteer community setup because that was covered in a previous training session. So this will be the master communities table that is the source for both modules of the software. We'll be covering the checklist setup. That includes distribution, publication setup, record inclusion policies, page messages, mapping systems, field display and field help, your download page, statistics, import and export. And if we have time at the end of the session, I'll also walk you through your web server statistics. The main contact of your database should already have received a login for you to access these statistics, and I'd like to spend a few minutes just showing you what they look like and what the various parts of it mean. So if there is time in our session today, I will cover that as well. Are there any questions about the agenda today, or anything that you think that I'm missing in the agenda? Because if you tell me now, I'll try and squeeze it in. Okay. So we'll start from the very beginning, and that is the general setup options of the database. From the main menu in either the volunteer or the community information software, clicking the setup link will bring you to our setup menu. And many of the items that we'll be covering today are on this particular page. The general setup options are a single set of options that apply to the entire database. So these are independent of any particular view in the database or security or anything. These are things that apply to the database as a whole. Depending on whether you are a community information super user or a volunteer super user, that will determine which items you can see on this page. You'll notice that some of them specifically say CIC or volunteer. That would imply that that particular item applies only to that module. If it does not say CIC or volunteer, that implies that it is a shared setting which applies to both areas of the software. The database name, the CIC database name, is the default name to be used in outgoing emails from the software. Note that there have been some changes to the way the outgoing emails work in terms of being able to send from multiple different addresses, such as in the Central East database, we would have ForInfo and Durham and the Central East all wanting to send out from their own database URL. So that is an independent setting somewhere else. But this is the descriptive name saying you have a record in, our community information database or something like that. And so that means for databases that have a lot of partners, this setting needs to be very generic because it does have to cover every single partner that you have in your database. So you can't put something specific like the ForInfo community information database because that would also show in all of the other partners' outgoing emails. So in many cases where we have large databases with many agencies, this will have to be something extremely generic like our community information database or our volunteer opportunities database. In cases where there's only one agency operating the software, it may be very specific. So it might say the Information Niagara community or the Information Niagara database or something really specific like that. There are two design templates that apply to the software as a whole, and they're to do with the admin area, which is where I am right now. It will always say database admin area at the top when you are in the administrative area of the software. And this is an area that applies to both the community information and volunteer software equally. This would also be what you would see on the login page. Mainly, it only applies to set up areas of the database, and the one exception is that login page, because everybody does share the same login page. That will apply to anyone who uses that page. Okay? The reason why we need a separate design template and print template for the admin area is because we're unable to have it in a specific view or even a specific module of the software. So that makes it impossible to determine what kind of a template to use because we're not associated with any specific view or module. So your admin template may be exactly the same as the rest of the template in your database if you only have one, such as in the case of Hamilton's database or Inform Hamilton's database or Information Niagara, where you really are just working with one set. But in others, you may have so many different agencies that have various different looks and feels, and they want to have something very generic for shared areas of the software. So that would be why you would have a separate administrative template. There are also default views in the software. The default views determine which view will be used for the public. So anyone who does not have a login to your database, if they visited your site, what view would they be presented with? Now, it is possible to have multiple public views, and the way that you do that is by going into your default view and saying that that default view is able to see other views, and that's something that we will cover next week. But the bottom line is that you have to have one single view that is the default public view in your database, and that default public view controls access to all other public views that you may create. And that applies to both the community information and the volunteer. Public print mode is a setting which does not necessarily, it's a little misleading because it doesn't necessarily make print mode available in all your public views. Rather, if you don't have this setting on, then you cannot make print mode available in your public views, okay? So print mode for the public is determined by two factors. One is this setting here, saying whether or not you generally would allow the public to have access to print mode, and just for demonstration purposes, I'll remind everyone what print mode is. Oops, wrong. Wrong again. I'm doing well today. So when I go into any given record, and I have print version new window, this is print mode. Okay, so it takes any given record, or sometimes it's a statistical report or your search results, and it opens it in a new window applying a print template. Okay, so we're determining whether or not this print version new window is available to the public based on the print mode, public print mode being activated and a print template being applied to that view. Okay, so those two things both have to be in place in order for the public to see this print version new window link. User initials. Whenever you are filling out a form, such as an update record form, and you see the Me button, whether the Me button prints your entire name or just your initials is determined by this setting, the user initial setting. In general, you do want to use the initial setting because it does preserve some privacy for the person who is doing the editing. This is important potentially when you're sharing records to others and you don't know what information they may publish about your record. If you only send information about the user's initials, you do preserve the individual privacy of those people who are doing the maintenance on those records. So it is definitely recommended that you use this setting and only have the user's initials show. The user's initials do have to be unique within the database, and that may mean using middle names or even putting an agency code in front of your initials to ensure that every user that is working in the database has unique initials, and you can distinguish which individuals are actually making changes and updates to the records. But all this setting does is determine what happens when you click that Me button, whether it's initials or whether it is your full first and last name as specified in the settings for your account. Training mode. You will never turn training mode on if you have it off right now. Training mode is a setting for people who have a brand new database to allow them to do their initial work in the database without sending out any outgoing emails. This is the only thing that training mode does. It does not prevent, it does not allow you to roll back changes to your records or protect any experimentation that you may do in the database. It only prevents outgoing emails from being sent out by the system. This is so that you can practice things like sending update email requests or other activities that may normally initiate an email without actually initiating that email. It also puts a great big red bar right across the top like this. The database is in training mode. The base URL. The base URL is the primary address by which you intend people to access your site. This can also end up being used in outgoing emails, although it is possible to specify other addresses through other setup areas in the software. But every single database has to have one default address that it assumes that people will use to access certain features of the software. This address is, as I say, sometimes used in outgoing emails. It is also used in cases like the volunteer software where it displays the little balls, the colored balls in the legend, in order to print out the full image location of those images. So it's used in a few places where it wouldn't really be obvious to the person accessing the software what the address is, but rather it's used by the software internally to understand how to display information. So this is an extremely critical setting. It must be present, and it must be a correct and valid way to access your database. Just like having a default view, this base URL is just a default. It is possible to have other addresses in your application, but you do have to have a default. And so you should consider these as quite equivalent in that they're the default basis by which the software determines how to do certain activities, but you can have other ways of accessing the software, other public views, other public addresses, but you must have a default. It is possible to have a different default for both the community information and the volunteer software, or they can be the same. In the base URL setting for volunteer, do not include the /volunteer as part of your address. That will be added automatically. As you can see by my setting here, it is very much possible to not have just a simple domain name. In my case, CIOC is a subdirectory within the rest of my application, so I have the full address to where the CIOC application lives. The DaySimps last email setting is used to simply flag to you when you are doing an individual email update request, meaning one from the record itself, not through a bulk operation, but through a single record, and I choose, I don't have one in this one, and I choose to send an email update request to that individual record. Okay, directly from the record details page. You'll see it says here, we don't have a record of the last day you sent an email update to this listing. That means that I personally have never sent an email update request from my own software to this particular record. If there was a record in the software of the last time that you sent them an email update request, and that is automatically recorded every time the system sends out an email update request, it would compare that date to the number that you have specified here, the number of days, and if it had been less than that number of days, it would flag a warning to you during this preparation process. It would flag a warning to you that you had last sent them an update um, sooner than the number of days that you specify here. So this is really intended to prevent you from harassing people by sending them too many email update requests or too frequent email update requests, so that they don't end up phoning you and saying, stop sending me emails. I don't want to get any emails from you anymore because they're getting too many requests. It does not prevent you from sending out that email. It simply warns you that it has been less than this number of days since the last time that you sent that request. And as it says here, it does apply to all modules of the database. So this date has to be agreed upon by all participants in the database. There are 3 new default emails that are part of the software as of the last software upgrade that you received on the weekend. It will be extremely important for all of you to go in and change these settings in your database, but there are some caveats about that happening, which I will explain at the upgrade teleconference later in this week, so please don't worry about this setting right now, because some of you who only have permissions in one module might have some difficulty initially putting these settings in, and I'll explain that at the upgrade teleconference. The default emails are used whenever the system generates an email for a record where it is unable to identify an agency email to use to send the record. So right now, the place that we use this is within your agency setup. You are supposed to specify an update contact email for each agency that owns records in your database. And we'll discuss that when we get to agency setup. But if it were the case where you hadn't specified an update email, in the past, the system simply would have failed to send the message because it would be unable to. It wouldn't have a message or an email address as the from, and so it just would not be able to send a message out. This could include an update email request. It could include when someone submits feedback, they wouldn't be able to send out any of the relevant emails about that feedback, even though it would record the feedback email, or it would record the feedback entry in the database. No emails would go out to anyone notifying them about that feedback, including the person who submitted the feedback. By having this setting, you protect yourself from that ever occurring, because whenever the software runs into that situation where there's no agency email, it would default to the email specified here. The long-term goal is that we would also be able to use this email address whenever new record suggestions were made. Currently, we can't send out any outgoing emails when a new record suggestion is made because there's no agency associated with a brand new record until someone creates a record and owns it. By having default emails, it means that in the future we will be able to send out all the proper notification emails, both to the person submitting the new record and to this email, so that they know that a new record suggestion came in. All right, so that's our long-term goal of what to do with these first 2 emails, the default email CIC and the default email volunteer. The third type of email applies specifically to the volunteer database, and specifically to volunteer databases that are using the new volunteer profiles area of the database. This email will be used as the to address for any correspondence sent out from the system to someone who has a profile in their database concerning their profile. So that would mean if they requested a change in password, and the system would automatically generate a change password email to them, or a retrieve password email to them if they forgot a password, or for instance when they have saved a search profile and they want to be notified of new opportunities, their notifications about those new opportunities would also come from this new default email address that's specifically for volunteer profiles. And that does apply across the entire database, so it's not specific to any one agency or any one view. Are there any questions about those default emails? Because those are new. I will be covering those again in detail at the upgrade teleconference as well. Okay, feedback messages. There are a couple of places where you'll see feedback messages, and this particular feedback message is the message that is printed when someone submits feedback. This is the message that is printed to the screen, okay? And that is telling them really whatever you want to. In general, it's telling them that their feedback is not processed instantly. That is a really important message, because otherwise people might expect that if they make a change, it should be there right away. So you'll want to tell them that it has to be reviewed and processed. And you probably want to give them an idea of when that feedback will be processed. So in this case, it would say within 10 business days. That would be whatever your internal policy is. There are 4 different settings for this. There's English and French community information and English and French volunteer. But because we actually don't have full French support in the volunteer software, the French version of the volunteer is really not important at this time. Next, we have export publication. Although it doesn't say so, this is specifically a community information setting because there are no publications in the volunteer software. So it's implicit that the publication is a community information setting, and the volunteer users would not see the setting. Export publication is when you are doing one of the 2 export formats that are not the sharing format. So that would be the basic XML format that you would use to bring your data into Access, or the Eddie-based export, that certain fields such as the publication description and the general headings that are involved in this particular kind of export are determined by whichever publication that you select here. Often, if people want to make use of this would be a setting that would change somewhat frequently, because you will get someone who wants to run a particular publication and do a particular export, and then down the road someone may want to export a different publication. When this was initially set up, most of our users had one single publication where they had general headings and descriptions, because before CIOC, this version of CIOC was developed, there was only one publication description field and only one set of general headings for the entire database. Obviously, when this version of CIOC came out, we allowed you to have as many different descriptions and general headings as you wanted, and that means that in order to export back to the old, really old now, format, where you had a single publication description and a single set of general headings, we have to pick which publication that applies to. That would often be someone's red book, green book, blue book, orange book, your community services directory. However, as the software has evolved, people are wanting to access more and more of their publications in a way that includes general headings and includes descriptions. So that has meant that this setting could potentially change frequently depending on what particular publication someone may want to export. Because we do have a lot of online publication tools, the need to export a specific publication in this way has really decreased, because in general people can do the printing of their records and their name indexes and so on directly through CIOC software and don't necessarily have to do it through an export the way that they did in the past. But that's the history of this field and what it means. And do be aware when you change it that it may impact someone else who has changed the setting for their own purposes. And be aware that you will impact them if you do change that setting. Because the XML format, the basic XML format that's for use in Access is also part of what's included in the community information download, this would also apply to your download in the publication description and general headings field of that download. Are there any questions about that? Okay, finally, we have our volunteer position counts field. I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend that every database use the first setting. Count each opportunity only once, the unique count. Before this version of CIOC, the software did its count in a very different way. I'll show you the counts that I mean. When I do search step 1, the counts that you see here of 4 opportunities and 10 individuals were made by summing up all of the different numbers that you see in each community. The problem with this is that you might have a single opportunity that was available in multiple communities, and it would count that multiple times. So let's say that between Amabel and Dundas, there was one opportunity that was in both Amabel and Dundas, and another one that was only in Dundas. Well, that would represent 2 opportunities between those 2 communities. If you don't use the unique count, it would actually count that as 3 opportunities instead of 2. And the only reason that we have ever left this other setting in, the count each opportunity once for every community it appears in, is we had a number of our users at the time of the last software redevelopment express concern that it would look like their opportunity counts had plummeted after the software upgrade, because where it used to count it once for every community, if you only counted it once for each opportunity, it could be half or less of the number of opportunities that it looked like they had before. And they didn't want the impression to be that they had suddenly stopped offering so many opportunities. However, this is an extremely misleading setting to use because it makes it look like there is a very inflated number of opportunities in your database. It's misleading to the people doing the search. They think there are far more opportunities than there are, and when they get to the final search results, they may be very confused about why there are far less opportunities than what they were expecting. So it's likely that in some future incarnation of CIOC, this second setting will no longer even be available. So I do encourage you all to check your setting and to see that you are using this first setting, and if you aren't, I encourage you to switch, because at some point it is highly likely that we are going to get rid of this second option altogether. Okay, any questions about that? One final note about the general setup options. All of the general setup options are cached within your application in the software, and when you update them, it automatically updates that cache. If you ever notice that the settings in your database do not reflect the settings that you see on this form, all you need to do is submit the form. You'll see this reset DB equals true. This is what signals the application to reset the general setup options. It has to be done once for every web address that you use. Pardon me, just a moment. Sorry. It has to be done once for every web address that you use in the software. Normally this only needs to happen after a software upgrade, and I would automatically do this for you. Access the reset DB equals true to make sure that the application cache was automatically reset. This will automatically be reset once a week as well when we reboot our servers. But it is important to be aware that these values are cached for efficiency's sake, to make the software operate in a faster, more efficient manner, because these settings apply once to the whole database and don't change very often. It allows the software to work faster by not having to retrieve those settings from the database with every access of every page. Are there any questions about general setup options? Okay. Next on our list, I'm going to cover agency setup, which will only take a moment. So from your main menu, there is the agency screen. Depending on whether you're an agency administrator or super user, you may not have access to this screen. An agency administrator would automatically be sent to the edit page of their own agency, whereas a super user would have full access to the complete list of record owner codes in the database. It is possible to have a record owner code apply to both modules of the software, so both community information and volunteer, or it may apply to only one. When we view the individual agency setup, It tells us whether or not the agency applies to any login accounts, so any users, how many records that agency owns in both areas of the software, so both the community information and the volunteer. And also, it will tell you whether or not you can delete that agency. You cannot delete an agency that's currently associated with a user or a record in the database. Every agency has a 3-letter code. We do attempt to keep that 3-letter code unique across all of our members and even beyond our membership into other agencies who contribute to provincial data sets and so on. So if you believe that you need a new record owner code, it's definitely worth taking the time to post on the bulletin board or contact me to find out whether that owner code that you want to use is already being used. It's extremely critical if you are involved in any record sharing activities, such as sharing into the 211 Ontario database and so on, that the record owner codes you use are validly assigned to you and that people are aware that you are using those codes and they're not being used by any other agency. You will see the record owner setup information for the particular module that you have permission for. So in this case, I have both CIC and volunteer permission and can see both. You should identify whether the agency has the permission to own particular kinds of records. So in this case, they only own organization records. They're not marked as being a volunteer record owner. The update email field that we discussed earlier is used during outgoing emails, email update requests, feedback submitted to records owned by that agency, and so on. It's really important that you fill this information out for every agency in your database. If you do forget, we now have the setting of the default email, but obviously it's far preferable to have the correct agency email for every agency in your database. Besides the update email, the other critical setting, and you see I don't have it filled out here, the other critical setting is the agency RSN. You really need to fill this out whenever the agency owns that particular type of record. So because this agency owns organization records, it's extremely important that I fill out the update email and the agency RSN. The agency RSN fetches additional information about that agency, such as the organization name, the mailing address, and so on. So the fax number, all of those contact points, and whenever the public gets an email, an update request, and so on from this agency, whether it be through submitting feedback or a new update request, the contact information that is printed is determined by this agency RSN. And if you don't supply an agency RSN, then what it will print out is unknown, which obviously is very unfriendly and doesn't look particularly good on the agency sending the information out if it doesn't include the name of the agency or any of its contact information. You can use a non-public record, so it just needs to be a record in your database with the correct name and contact information. It does not have to have a description or any other information in the record, and it is perfectly acceptable to use a non-public record for this purpose. To find the RSN, or the record number of the organization, you can do a search by organization name. And you can see it would give you the RSN, which you copy and paste into the agency setup. Once you add the RSN, you would be able to launch the record details page just to confirm the record that you are currently using for that agency setup. You'll notice in my organization finder, we do have the alert column, which would tell me if a record was non-public, such as this one, so that you can be sure that you are using the appropriate records. Again, we use the RSN rather than the friendly record number, such as Act 0001. Any questions about agency setup? It is really important to have an agency entry for every agency that is in your database, and that includes records that are owned by external agencies where you import their information. So in the case of if Halton was importing some Hamilton records, it's likely that Halton would want to set up the agency, the record owner codes for those individual agencies so that if someone submitted feedback, they would be able to get acceptable information. Even if you set up the agency code and put your own agency's contact information, that's better than not having the agency code there at all, okay? A little tip for determining whether you have records owned by agencies other than the ones in your agency list is from your advanced search. The drop-down list that you see here only consists of the record owners that I have set up in my database, okay? So I can't search for it that way, but down in @SQL, I can say record owner not in, and then supply the list of record owner codes I know I use. Okay, so they're in single quotation marks separated by commas, and this would bring up only records that were not owned by Slam, Dunn, Ham, or Egg. Okay, so just to review that again. Record owner not in, and then you can provide a list. There's brackets around it, and it's a comma delimited list with single quotation marks around each agency. And the not in will allow me to identify specifically those records that had record owner codes that were unexpected, so ones where they weren't within the list of agencies that I was expecting. And in fact, there are more complicated ways. If you're interested, there are more complicated SQL statements that can be used to directly reference your agencies table, and I would be able to provide that on the CIOC bulletin board if someone was interested in those more complex queries. If you have already a large number of record owners in your database where just typing them out is not a realistic way of doing this, you want to make a direct reference to the list you already have, I can provide that at SQL offline via the bulletin board. How did I get to the Edit Agency page? So again, from the main menu, either the volunteer or the community information, I get to the agency setup by clicking Agencies from the main menu. Okay? And again, if you're an agency administrator, rather than a super user, it would take you directly to the page to edit your own agency. You would not have permission to edit the full list of agencies. All right, next on my list is going to be the checklist setup. So again, from your main menu in both community information and volunteer, you can access the checklist setup area by clicking on checklist. The checklist setup page is the same page for everyone, but you would only see the checklists that apply according to your permissions. Because I am a community information and a volunteer super user, I see the shared checklist as well as both the CIC and volunteer checklist. In the case of community information, the checklists are all of the value settings in the database except classification systems like the taxonomy, NAICS, and the thesaurus, as well as the publication setup. So those items are managed separately. For the volunteer, all of the, and also the community setup. And for the volunteer, all of your value settings except the community setup are done from the same area, which is through the volunteer checklist setup. For the shared checklists, although they are called shared, it's important to understand that they primarily impact the community information software. So in most cases, it should be the community information partner who is responsible for maintaining all of these shared checklists. They are called shared checklists because they do affect the portion of the record that applies in the volunteer database as well, meaning the other agency info. These values affect those particular fields, so that is why they have been put into the shared area. However, the actual editing of the portions of the record that use these checklists is part of the community information software, so it is primarily the community information partner that should be changing these values. Most of these checklists have a very similar interface for modification. There will be of one of two types: a basic checklist like fees, funding, languages, accessibility will be comprised of an English name and a French name and a display order. You may not see the French name depending on, actually I think everyone sees the French name even if you're not using the French version of software, but you may not see the French name. The display order would give you the possibility of altering the way that these items were displayed within a record that was other than alphabetical order. So if in this case, obviously deposit alphabetically occurs much earlier than publications. However, because the display order is specifying that it occurs later, when these are printed out in a record that, say, had both publications and deposits as part of its fee type, it would always display publications before deposit. Okay? It is possible to have the same display order for all the items in your checklist. In that case, it would simply display them in alphabetical order. Often, people may have one or two items that they want to occur first, such as with languages, where they want English and French to occur before all other items. So you can see I have 1 and 1, so that these always occur first in the list. And then all other items are listed with a display order of 2, so that they all file alphabetically, but after English and French. Another note about display order: the numbers can be anywhere between 0 and 255. These numbers can repeat. If you do want to have custom display orders, I do recommend that you leave gaps in between. That gives you the ability to fill those in later with other values without having to renumber your complete list. And because with our checklist setup, you do have to modify each checklist item one at a time. I can't simply go through and say, 0, 1, 2, 3, and then update. I have to first update this one, and then update this one, and then update this one at a time. It's extremely tedious. If you leave yourself some gaps, then you won't ever have to do that if you want to insert an item between other items. But also, if you use the method that we see on this form here, where I'm only designating between a first set and a second set, and letting the software automatically alphabetize the rest of the list, that again is going to save you a lot of trouble later if you have to insert a new value. You just determine which of the two groups it belongs to, and then the software will automatically sort it alphabetically. The alphabetical sort would apply by language as well. This particular item, the languages, has an additional option called on form. That is because when you work with the languages setup, there are some predetermined values that display on the form, but you also have the ability to type in additional values from this list. This is so that you can keep the form short. I'll give you a little demonstration. Or agency info. This allows you to keep the form short, but still have a very complete set. So in this case here, you'll see that I'm only showing about 9 different languages as predefined languages on my form, but I have the ability to specify other values. They still have to come from this giant list that I have here, which is far more than 9 values. Only the ones where I've selected Show on Form are going to show in this predefined checklist. So if you only select values that are most frequently used in your database, you will save yourself some time in that the forms will be much more compact and easier to use, but you still protect yourself from misspellings and so on because you still have to use the valid values that you've entered in the list. So it prevents the chronic misspelling of languages like Portuguese, where I've seen at least 3 different variations that occur all the time. If you have one official version of the spelling Portuguese in your list, then you know when you type it in, if it's wrong, you will be notified that you've used an incorrect value. but that doesn't mean that you have to include it on your form, so you don't have a list of 200 languages. Oh, there was a specific question about whether the checklists are, who the checklists affect. And it is important to understand that things like showing on the form or any other changes you make to the checklist do apply across the entire database. So they can't be only for one agency or only for one view. All of the checklist setups apply across the entire database. And they are obviously by module according to the breakdown that you saw on the previous page. So you can see which ones apply to CIC, volunteer, and all the modules, but they do apply across the whole database. Any other checklist questions? Okay. So a few other types of checklists. We reviewed the basic type, which is the name and the order. We also have types of checklists that have codes associated with them, and there are a few examples of those. Distribution is one, so you'll see it's otherwise very similar. There is no order. We do have a code associated with it. Okay. Another example would be service level, where again we have a specific code associated, and then a name. And words is another. Okay. And record type and quality. You'll notice that the specific code, the format of the code has varied between these different items. They do each have their own particular validation or requirements about what is allowed in those codes. So in the case of record quality and record type, a single letter is what is allowed, whereas in the case of a distribution, the code is anything that's allowed for a publication code. So that would be any combination of numbers and letters and hyphens. And if you enter an invalid code for any of these objects, it would give you an error and also tell you what the proper formatting of that particular code would be. Okay, a few others that we have. You'll see the extra drop-downs here. Note that this is not where you edit the names of the extra drop-downs. Okay. The name of the extra drop-downs is within the field display, which I'll cover later. So this is only where you modify the values of those extra checklists. If you want to change it from saying extra drop-down A and use it for some particular purpose, that's done within the field display setup that we'll look at later. Okay. There are a bit more complex, even than that, setups for some of the volunteer areas, in particular the specific and general areas of interest. The areas of interest, the general areas of interest are modified just like the basic checklist that we saw earlier. However, the specific areas of interest, because they are quite a complex configuration, they have a totally different kind of editing form. You can add a new one by specifying an English and potentially a French value, or you can pick an existing one from the list and click Update. This is where you would have the ability to modify the name of the specific area of interest and specify which general areas of interest that applies to. Okay? Again, that's very different from the rest of the checklist. That should cover pretty much all of the different types. Do be aware that when you update certain kinds of checklists, it can have quite a significant impact on the database as a whole. Certain checklists won't allow you to remove those checklists if there are records using them. Some checklists, like languages, funding, fees, that have information that's used for keyword searching, when you update those values, all of the search fields in all of the records that use that value have to be updated with the new value. And that means there can be quite a lag in the database while all of this updating takes place and the re-indexing of all of these search fields. So although it will automatically update all of those records that use those values, it can cause quite a lag. This is different from the case for distribution, where that's not part of a search index. So when you update, say, a distribution code, it's going to update that distribution code in all the records that use it, but it doesn't actually have any high impact to the records because it doesn't have to do any additional work in those records for the purposes of search indexes and so on. There is one exception to the automatic updating within the, or two exceptions, pardon me, to the automatic updating in the records, and that is the postal box and the street type. If you change a street type value, say I take avenue and I change it to say avenue, the full value, this would not actually change the value in any of the records. That is because the values in the database are not actually constrained by this list. This is very different from all of the other checklists in the database. It is possible, say through a record import from another database, to obtain a record that has a different street type than the ones that you use in your checklist. So it wouldn't just not import that record, and it wouldn't use an incorrect value. It would go ahead and import that record, but when you go to update that record, it would also include the existing value in the list, even though it's not part of your own checklist for this value. Because this is not what we call constrained, meaning we're not restricting you to this list at the database level, we don't update the records when you update the checklist value. So please be aware of that. I can't come in here and simply change the word dir to drive and have it update in all the records. This is very different from the other checklists that would automatically compensate for the changes that you make. All right, that's it for checklists. Do we have any other questions about checklists before I move on? Okay. Next on our list is community. So again, the community setup is, we're specifically talking about what we call the communities table. So this is a very large hierarchical table that is distributed with the software. Although the volunteer communities use this table as a basis for their own communities, the management is done on the community information side of the software. So this is very different from if I went to the volunteer menu and hit communities, totally different communities management than what we're talking about right now. Although it is very possible that the volunteer software may have a desire or a need to modify those global communities, the communities table on which all of the geographical information is based in the software. If that were the case, they would have to contact their community information partner if they didn't have community information permissions to get them to make the modifications, because this is managed from the community information side. So as I say, this is a hierarchical description of all of the communities, not just in Ontario, but it will include countries, so U.S., Canada, Mexico. It would include the continent of North America and so on, down to the smallest little neighborhoods potentially. There are authorized values, meaning values that CIOC distributes as official, and there is also the ability to create local values that reflect local geographic needs and setup. We are fully aware that the communities list needs an update, and that update will have to involve communication with all of our members directly to have an understanding of what local changes they've made to the communities in their own area to incorporate these and distribute them to everyone. Go on to edit a specific community here. When you edit a community, it will tell you some information about it, whether or not it's being used by any organization or program records. If that community is a parent for another community, you'll remember that I said the communities occur in a hierarchy, and it'll tell you whether or not you can delete the community. This can be a little misleading because these are not the only factors involved in whether or not you can actually delete this community, because the volunteer software also has an influence over whether or not you can delete a community. If they are using one of these communities within their software, that will also block you from deleting this community, okay? So it's not just within the community information software. This does have an impact on the community, on the volunteer software as well. You can specify a name and potentially a French name if it's different for that record. You can specify a display name as well. That is specifically intended for the search results in cases where when the public is viewing a list of search results, they may not have an understanding, especially some of the smaller communities, and you can use a more general label to apply a different look when someone is looking at a set of search results and they're looking at the located in. This would give a different label to that community, okay? And also you specify a parent community. There should only be one community in the entire database that doesn't have a parent community, and that is not known. There are two special communities in the database, one called not limited and one called not known. And not known is the parent of not limited, and not known should be the only community in the database that doesn't have a parent. The software depends on the hierarchy of communities to properly perform and execute searches. So if a community isn't properly placed within the hierarchy of communities, searches will not work properly. So the parent community should always be filled out for any new community that you are working with, and really any community at all except that top level community, which is the parent of all others, which is the not known community. Are there any specific questions about community setup? I'm sure there are. There's one question to address how communities work when you share your records externally, so outside of your database. I had mentioned that there were both authorized and local communities. If you create local communities in your database, they would normally have an authorized community as a parent. When you create an export in the sharing format, it would include not just the local community, but also the authorized community that is the parent to that local community that you created. So if I wanted to have the neighborhood of Westdale, which is within Hamilton, and that is a local community that only applies to me in my database, and I share that record with Halton, part of what would be shared with them is the local community, so Westdale, as well as there would be a note specifying that the parent of Westdale is the authorized parent of Westdale is the community Hamilton. That way, when Halton received the record, if they also had the local community of Westdale, then it would use that local community. If they did not have the local community of Westdale, then it would look at the authorized parent, which is Hamilton, and it would put the local community of Westdale as a note next to Hamilton. So it would translate areas served Westdale or located in Westdale as the located would change to located in Hamilton, and the areas served would change to located in Hamilton with a note that says Westdale. Any questions or clarification needed on that? Because we are looking to do a major update of the communities, there was a post on the bulletin board by Ross Cooling some time ago. I really hope that everyone will do their best to participate in that process. It is going to be a very time-consuming process and will go much smoother with the active participation of every single one of our members to help us to understand your local areas. That also means that through provincial data sharing projects and so on, your community will be more effectively served if every one of our members has an accurate reflection of the way that your local areas are organized. So it really is in your best interest to participate in that effort. Okay. Okay, so I had mentioned two of the special communities, the not limited and not known, and there was a question about how those are used. They're used literally in the way they sound. So take not known. That would be in a case where you really did not know either what the area served or the located in was. This is far better than leaving it blank for a couple of reasons. One, you will get better search results. Two, it often will prompt the organization that is represented by the record to put in an appropriate value. If it says areas served not known and you send them out an email update request, they're likely to change not known into something that means something. Not limited, on the other hand, is intended to represent records that do not have a particular location or do not have any particular boundaries. This might be an internationally applicable organization or website, or a virtual organization that has no specific location. Does that clarify for everyone? You can navigate the hierarchy of communities through the Community Finder, which you'll, I have to show it to you, just a moment. The Community Finder pop-up, which I have brought up from the Communities editing window, will allow you to navigate the hierarchy of communities. So it will show you any given community name you search for, where that community is located, and what smaller communities are part of that larger community. Okay? So Halton Region is in Greater Toronto Area, which is in Central Ontario, which is in Ontario, which is in Canada, which is in North America, which is in International, which is in Not Limited, and finally that very special Not Known, which is at the very top and has no parent. Okay? And so on and so forth. Okay, so that's it for communities. Next on our list is publication setup. So from the main community information menu, you will see the publication setup area. The first thing you'll see is that you can create a print version of the entire list of publications. It will organize them by code, specify their names in English and French if that's applicable, identify whether or not that is non-public, and identify how many records in the entire database use that publication. This is not by view, this is the whole database. When you go to manage a particular publication, it will indicate whether or not there are any views using that publication, meaning that the records in that view would all have to belong to this particular publication. It would indicate how many records are using that publication. And keep in mind that when you search, it will only show you those records that are actually in your current view. So although this may be being used by one organization or program record, it may be that that one record is not in my current view. So it is possible to do a search and have it come up with nothing. And that would imply that that one record was not part of your view. There is some data management information about the publication. So when it was created, who created it, when it was modified, and who last modified it. So if I submit update, it would change it so that it was last modified today by me. And again, this is using my initials because that is what I had specified in my general setup options. If I had said don't use initials, it would have my full first and last name there. The primary way we identify publications is by their code. The code can be alphanumeric as well as having hyphens. Other than that, it is very restricted. You cannot even have underscores or any other non-alphanumeric characters, but it does allow hyphens. The name is optional, but is obviously very useful as a descriptive identifier for the publication code. When you are using publication codes for quick lists that are public, for example, you'll want to have a friendly name because the public would not understand what the code means. You can specify whether or not a particular publication is public or non-public. And again, that would apply, say, to the quick list. about which publications would be listed in that quick list if it was a non-public view. And you can specify whether or not this publication is allowed on display in forms. What that means is, if I say it's allowed on display in forms, then you can use the special seals that are associated with every publication, and we discussed earlier that that was the publication description and the general headings, that you could use those as independent fields, meaning when I go to do my field setup that we'll look at later, if I've said that this is allowed on display in forms, then I will be able to add this field to my record, add these fields to my record details. I'd be able to search in these fields through any of the custom field searches on the advanced search, and I'd also be able to add them to a feedback form, so that when the public was submitting record suggestions, that they would be able to see and suggest changes to those publication fields, the publication description and the general headings that apply to this particular publication. You have to associate specific general headings with the publication. You can't just free-form enter a list of general headings. Every publication has its own independent list of general headings. And again, we have the ability to create a print version to do a report in a new window. I'll create a new general heading. You'll notice that there is a setting called Use Heading. This is a very similar setup to the thesaurus and has a lot of the same kinds of theories about how you can relate headings to one another and have what we call see also references or see references, which are use instead. I'm going to create a couple of different general headings here so we can discuss how those work. Okay, so with my new heading 3, I'm going to say that my new heading 3 is related to the heading my new heading 2. What that means is that it's just like two related terms in the thesaurus of the taxonomy. I'm saying that these two headings have some association with one another. Why do we care about putting these associations? Well, when we go to do publications, which we will be discussing 2 sessions from now, and you go to do your subject index, which is based on general headings, your subject index would indicate that if you're interested in this particular topic, which is my new heading 3, that you may also be interested in the heading my new heading 2, and it would say see also my new heading 2 within that subject index. I can also create what are the equivalent of unused terms. So let's say I have my new heading 2, which is an alternate way of saying that is an alternate way of saying that this is my new heading 2. Let's say, pardon me, I'm trying to understand why it's not giving me the ability to indicate what to use instead, which it should be. Oh, it's okay, sorry, I'm mixing this up with this thesaurus management. So I can say that it's related to my new heading and it's unused. And what this will mean is in the subject index, it's going to have a listing for my new heading 2, but it's going to say, rather than list any records associated with that, it's going to tell the person reading the index that they should instead be using my new heading 2, and it's going to say see my new heading 2 instead of see also, which would mean you know, I might have records associated with a heading, but you could also look at this other topic. By having an unused heading, it's not going to be possible to add this heading to any record. So when I'm doing the actual record update process, I would not be able to add this particular heading to the record. But in a subject index, it would print this unused heading out and point to this other heading. And potentially I can have more than one that I'm pointing to. So are there any questions about general headings? And again, we'll be going really in depth into the subject indexes and how these play into those subject indexes at the session on publications and print profile. And we did already discuss, and I'll go through again. Probably now I should go through again how we actually add these headings to records, because I know that that wasn't covered properly at the session that we had for data management. So when I go to update publications within the record, and I add 211 Ontario, I go to update the 211 Ontario publication. That's how I can add a publication description. You can automatically insert the existing description, and then I can modify it, say if I wanted to make it more brief for my publication. So I only wanted just the basic first part of the description. And I can add specific headings to the record. You'll notice that that unused heading is not in the list and not available to me to add to this particular record. You'll see a list of existing headings, which you can just uncheck in order to update and remove those headings. And again, you can add any other used heading to the record, 4 at a time. Okay. Any questions about publications or general headings? Okay. And again, we'll get into a lot more detail about how those general headings work in the name indexes 2 weeks from now. All right, next on my list are record inclusion policies. So this has changed with the last software upgrade. Through the main setup area, I now have a separate management area for record inclusion policies. You can now have as many different record inclusion policies as you want in your database, and apply those inclusion policies to whichever specific views that you want. And it is possible to apply the same inclusion policy to both volunteer and community information, although in general that isn't going to make sense. It is possible because the management area is the same for both. So the full list of policies available is equally managed by both the community information and volunteer software. Every inclusion policy has to have a language associated with it, and then you can enter in as much policy content as you want. The inclusion policies are displayed whenever someone wants to submit a request for a brand new record, whether that be a brand new volunteer opportunity or a new community information record. So this is brand new, not an existing record update. If you have an inclusion policy specified, it's going to indicate, it's going to present a link, and that would pop up a new window where people could read the inclusion policy text that you include here. Unlike in the past where you had one inclusion policy for the whole database, the ability to have multiple inclusion policies means that if you have a customized view or multiple agencies operating independently within your database, they can each have their own inclusion policy. They no longer all have to draw from the same inclusion policy. The way that they each have their own inclusion policies is through the view setup. So I'll just quickly go into setup views and show you where we actually select the inclusion policies. You can see you independently select an inclusion policy for English and an inclusion policy for French. And in each case, you can only select the inclusion policy that is in that language. So when I pick the inclusion policy for the English version, I only am presented with English inclusion policies, and for French, I'm only presented with French inclusion policies. Note that they say French and English just because that's the literal title of those inclusion policies. It wouldn't necessarily be saying English and French for you when you do that. Any questions about inclusion policies or those changes? Okay. Next, we're going to discuss page messages. This is also a major change with the latest software upgrades. In the past, page messages were assigned on a per-page basis, and the page message applied to the entire software. So if I added a page message to the login page, that would apply in any case. And if I added a page message to the main search page, that would apply for every view in the software for that particular search page, no matter what. The new page message setup allows you to have a lot more customization. I suppose I should start out by saying, why would you want to use a page message?